this is Barrie, a city constantly evolving. At any time, a whole host of pressures challenge the intricate tapestry of city government. In this series, we will explore the priorities deemed essential for progress, even if they don't always inspire unanimous applause. Join me each week for a candid conversation with a member of our city government as we uncover the stories behind the scenes of Barrie, a city on the move. Welcome to Barrie, City on the Move. I'm your host, Arif Khan, and thank you for having me join you in your home or on your device, wherever you're receiving this content. In this series, we look to explore a whole host of topics that really, the goal is to improve the quality of life for residents of Barrie, the taxpayer, the homeowners, etc. And we explore that through taking a look inside Barrie City Hall, city governance, and operations. And one of the topics that is at the forefront of every conversation is, well, the growth of the city, how we're growing, and how we're really working with land use planning. And to speak with me on that topic today is Michelle Banfield, who's the Executive Director of Development Services. I think I got that right.
You got that perfect.
Michelle,
thank you.
Thanks for joining me on the show.
Well,
I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
It is nice to see you. Your role, your job continues to evolve, and it is complex. And I thought maybe just for the first few minutes, let's have a bit of a recap of what has changed overall when it comes to land use planning, as well as zoning bylaws, and really who's got their finger in the pie when it comes to planning and then eventually the final decision making on how a city will grow.
Well, thanks. That's a great question. And so I think a lot has changed in land use planning, certainly in the last 5 or 6 years in the province of Ontario, not just in the city of Barrie. I think it's important to know the things that the city of Barrie is dealing with are province-wide. It's not just the city. Any sort of change that the provincial government makes to any land use planning legislation, it impacts everybody from the city of Barrie to Timmins to Toronto. And so, as I said, the city of Barrie is in good company. Let's just put it that way. From a land use planning perspective, the Bible of land use planning really is the official plan. And that is a document that really sets the vision and the goals for the growth in the municipality. We all know that the city of Barrie is a large and fast growing municipality recognized by the province of Ontario as our role in that. And so at the end of the day, the official plan kind of sets the goals and objectives of where we want that growth to go. There are some areas of the city that are better poised to accept more people and more jobs than other areas of the city. So the official plan really tries to set those areas first. And then the next step is the zoning bylaw. And the zoning bylaw follows closely under the official plan. And I always say that that's how land use documents work. You've got the official plan and the zoning is right underneath there. The zoning is much more detailed, but it really operationalizes the vision in the official plan. Now, in the province of Ontario, the City of Barrie's official plan is actually approved by the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing. So council will adopt it, and council will say, this is our community's vision, and then it's actually approved by the province, which is a little different than, say, another municipality in Simcoe County that would actually have the county approve their official plan. In the case of the City of Barrie, it's actually the province. And so we got that provincial approval for our official plan in May of 2024. And kind of hot on the heels of that, we've been doing some work on the zoning bylaw, and now we're at the point where we're consulting on a new zoning bylaw, and the idea is to bring the official plan to life through some more details, some more variations in land uses, but really it is about giving businesses and homeowners and property owners in the city of Barrie direction on what they can do and what they can use their property for.
So this is a complex topic.
Very.
Let's just give me a bit of an idea, though, and obviously some of it's coming back, muscle memory for me, but for the sake of our audience as well as myself, how long, what's sort of the lifespan of an official plan? How often are we looking at approving and then planning for the next official plan?
For sure. So official plans in general are supposed to last about 10 years, about a 10-year span. And around the 5-year mark, you're supposed to take a look at, how you're doing. Is the vision still applicable? What's changed? But generally speaking, it's around a 10-year mark. Now, that being said, it takes a long time to actually produce these documents and revise these documents. So sometimes municipalities have an official plan or a zoning bylaw longer than a 10-year span. But again, there's still the ability to kind of either do little tweaks or sometimes do kind of the term is housekeeping amendments to kind of change little things. If there's, say, a change in provincial policy or something, or a new trend that's coming up, and you say you can't wait for the whole zoning bylaw to get revisited, and and coach houses are one of those examples we talked about, where you kind of do a little tweak along the way so you can kind of catch up to some zoning trends. But generally speaking, you're looking at, as I said, around a 10-year plus timeline. Now, that being said, official plans are actually supposed to guide growth for much longer than 10 years. But at this point, it's also about, what's the near term, like the 10-year plan. And in planning terms, it does take a bit of time. You hear about that a lot. It does take a bit of time to go from a vacant piece of property to people actually living in a new home or a new apartment building or what have you. So 10 years kind of in the cycle of planning actually isn't that long.
It's interesting. As you were speaking, and don't ask me why I went there, but I actually pictured the stock market, and I pictured Warren Buffett versus pretty much every other trader in the market. And there are a lot of day traders who look to make quick cash, they look to make some quick profits by doing some strategic moves, et cetera, on day trading. But then there's Warren Buffett, who's always played long. And so, as you talked about these housekeeping amendments and what's changed and what's happening in the markets and what's happening politically, that could be your day trader, but there's always a long play. Tell me, in the course of your career, what have you seen in terms of trends as it applies to what's happening on an annual basis, some nuances that might be happening in a more sort of a short-term period versus the long play during your career?
Well, it's interesting because you're right, planning, that's a great way of describing it. Planning is a long-term play, if you will, and it's a profession that it takes a long time to get a lot of projects under your belt. I always say planners aren't app designers, like we don't do something in 2 weeks and then we're gone. It takes a long time for projects to go from conception to reality. But I think at the end of the day, when you're actually doing principles of community building, which is really what planning is all about, is making sure that your community has more than just homes. It has homes, it has places of worship, it has schools, it has parks, it has shops, it has jobs, it has the healthcare services that you need. That's all the stuff that we talk about. It has transit, the complete community piece to it. None of those things happen overnight, and so it's a little bit of living for today and the reality of a City of Barrie resident that kind of gets up in the morning, puts out their garbage, that sort of thing, but also planning for the City of Barrie resident in the future, or as I like to think about it, the kids that are growing up in our community now, what sort of community do they want when they're kind of done school and raising their own families? And so I think the City of Barrie always has been a great place to raise children and raise your families and age in place, I guess, if you will. But at the end of the day, those pieces do take a long time to come together.
So for anybody at home who is watching and looking at this and maybe throwing popcorn at the screen or whatever it might be, as they either agree with or disagree with the trajectory of the place they call home. I mean, certainly if we look back to the 1980s versus today, there's a big difference. There's a big difference in our quality of life, but there's also a difference in terms of just if you were to put a side by side and look at them, I mean, it's almost unrecognizable. So let's talk about that for a second, because a lot of residents would reasonably turn to their city or local governance, their councillor or their mayor, to offer their input, whether it's constructive or critical, whatever you might want to call it. However, as you mentioned, I think it's worth talking about, municipal government, the Municipal Act is an extension of the Provincial Act, right? So the municipal government, they are stewards of and really implementers of an overarching prescribed set of guidelines and legislation handed down by a province. So when it comes to city building and community building, what does that relationship look like? what influence and what guidance and what impact can local governance have when it's still being approved by a province?
Well, I mean, I think at the end of the day, the province wants to build complete communities, and so does the City of Barrie. I think what's important to remember is the province of Ontario is really diverse. And so if you think about obviously Toronto versus Northern Ontario versus Thunder Bay versus Sarnia, like it's just a very big province, quite frankly. If anyone's tried to drive out of it, it takes days, right? So it's very big. And there is a bit of a hierarchy. Like the cities have a role to play in the province. And so the City of Barrie is a city, and it's urban, and it's going to become more urban. But that's the role that the City of Barrie has to play. In particular, if you think about the city in the context of the county of Simcoe, it's where our hospital is, it's where our college is, lots of jobs, lots of shopping. But with that, obviously, comes busyness and that feel of a city, right? So, but then there's some other municipalities, even not too far around us, that are much more driven by agriculture or more rural land uses or smaller communities, but at the city itself, it's, as I said, it's urban, and it provides a lot of services to not only City of Barrie residents, but residents of Simcoe County as well. And so it's sometimes a challenge for the City of Barrie resident that, like as you said, moved in maybe 40 years ago to a much different place than they are now, and the city is changing around them possibly faster than they ever thought was going to happen, especially when you compare, say, the city's growth to even some of the other municipalities around Simcoe County. I'm sure every municipality is experiencing growth and change, but not really at the same scale that the City of Barrie is, right? Mm-hmm. So I think at the end of the day, you have to kind of look at the value that cities bring to the province, the economic drivers and those types of things, and it is a bit of a balance, right? You kind of have to kind of weigh out kind of the busyness and the hustle and bustle of a city versus the services that it provides.
Now, before we go to break, just to tee up when we come back from the break, inside the official plan or due to the official plan, we have conversations around zoning and zoning bylaws, and there are some new zoning designations sort of. We'll get into what used to be and what is now, and maybe you can give us a bit of an idea of what that looks like.
For sure.
Is that a dramatic change, or is it more just, again, a housekeeping to make it more relevant for today? We'll get into that.
For sure.
And then let's get into also some of the public consultation that you've been engaging in, and does it matter? Does it really matter? Let's lead with that question when we come back for the break. Does public input and consultation actually matter? Does it make a difference? So I'll leave you to think on that one while we go to break. Stay with us for more on Barrie City on the Move with Michelle Banfield, Executive Director of Development Services. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Barrie City on the Move, and I'm here with Michelle Banfield, Executive Director of City of Barrie's Development Services. We're talking about land use planning and zoning, and I left you hanging with a question, and I think it is a question that often crosses the lips of people at home, whether it's around the kitchen table or amongst friends and neighbors. Does my input actually matter? And we're in a period right now of public consultation in a variety of things, whether it comes to the city's budget, whether it comes to the police services budget, we're taking community surveys, but now you and your department and your colleagues are actually engaging in public consultation around land use planning and zoning.
Correct.
Talk to me about why my opinion actually matters, and how do you take that, aggregate it, distill it, dissect it, and put it to use?
Well, the City of Barrie really does try to get public input on a variety of things, and you just listed a few of them. I always encourage residents to go to buildingbarrie.ca, and that is the city's engagement platform. And if you go to buildingbarrie.ca, you'll see it's a tile of all these different projects that the City of Barrie is accepting feedback on. And that could be new parks or park revitalizations. It could be budget, as you said. It could be the zoning bylaw. There's tons of opportunities, and I always encourage people to do that. And if there's a topic you're interested in, if you kind of click on it, you can register to get updates. So when the project moves along to different phases, you get updated. So from a planning perspective, we always talk about there's some prescribed consultation that has to take place if there's a change in your community, either through a planning application, a committee of adjustment application, this new zoning bylaw. There's some prescribed consultation opportunities in the Planning Act that we have to do, and that's when you see the signs on the property, you see that we have a public meeting. If you're within a certain radius of a property, you'll get a letter in the mail. Always pay attention if you get those letters in the mail from the City of Barrie. And so those are the types of consultation that we have to have under the Planning Act. We have to give you enough notice, we have to tell you how you can participate, and when you comment officially in a Planning Act application, we have to basically say, as registered professional planners, we got this comment and we made this change because of the comment, or we didn't make this change and here's why. So we actually have a professional responsibility to respond to all of those comments. Now, I know sometimes people will say, I came out and the City Council approved it anyway. And I think it's important to know that registered professional planners like myself, we make recommendations to Council. We take all of the feedback, we do a technical circulation, we listen to the community, and we make a recommendation to Council. But ultimately, land use planning decisions are approved by your members of Council, and in some cases a committee of adjustment, which is a Council-appointed committee. So planners really just make that recommendation. But sometimes people will say, I made this comment and Council approved it anyway, or I made this comment and the committee of adjustment approved it anyway. And that kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier. The City of Barrie is a city, and generally speaking, you can develop and build in a city. And so that's ultimately, in most cases, why you're not going to necessarily go from a development proposal kind of coming forward to absolutely nothing. Like, it's very rare for it to go, completely like, oh, okay, forget it, we're not going to do anything. But where you see the public input really coming in is sometimes a building is proposed to be higher than it's ultimately approved for. Sometimes it's closer to a lot line, and then you get some public feedback that says, can't you be closer, can't you be further away from my property line, or can you move maybe the parking, or can you move the garbage dumpsters? Like, there's some of those details that actually get changed a lot through consultation. Where you're going to snow your snow storage, where you're going to store that. A lot of people don't want it against their fence because it's going to create pressure on their fence and those types of things. So while you don't necessarily see the feedback going from something to nothing, you absolutely see feedback that refines the plan, that sometimes changes what the building might look like, might change what is actually used, the building's used for. And that all comes through public consultation.
Mm-hmm. One of the things, as you were speaking, I was having again another deja vu, and I was thinking about other communities around our country, our province, or even our neighbors to the south. And when you look at some of these communities that maybe before they knew that they were going to become a city, their local governance made decisions that were pretty much, someone puts in an application, it gets approved. As long as the permit is paid, or as long as the right boxes are checked, it gets approved. And you see some communities that you kind of wonder, was somebody asleep at the wheel when they designed this community? And when I think of the official plan, and when I think of the work that you're talking about, it actually sort of comes together in that sense to me, that it is a way of ensuring that the bigger picture, that there's some logic behind it, that there's some sense to it, that we're actually, while each individual land or parcel of land may take time to develop and at its own rate, depending on financing or the motivation of the current owner of that parcel of land, there's actually a bigger picture that we're trying to work towards. How would you describe the bigger picture for the City of Barrie as you understand it right now?
Well, I think that's a great point. You think the one thing that popped into my mind when you were talking about it was roads. And there's a lot of things about land use planning that isn't defined by property boundaries. So obviously, if you're the property owner, it's really important to you, the boundaries of your property. But when you look at that bigger picture, and roads are kind of one of those examples, like you don't want a road to just service one property. Many, many times when you look at building a road, you want it to service many properties or many different uses, and you're not doing, otherwise you'd have a whole bunch of like little tiny streets all across the city and they don't connect to anything, right? So so I think that's kind of one of the pieces. The other thing is that from a land use planning perspective, it really doesn't matter to a planner when we're looking at a property who owns it. Like a lot of times people say, you know, does it matter? It doesn't matter who owns it. We look at it at super high level and we want that comprehensive planning to happen. So even if there's a larger area of property, for example, and a small piece of it comes in for a development application, you know, we kind of say, well, what happens when the properties around you develop? Where sometimes you'll see a little stub road, or you'll see a lot that's being held so the road can go through at a different time or what have you. But we do that a lot, where we say to people, okay, it's not just enough to develop your property. A good example of that is kind of in the south end of the city, where streets and roads and infrastructure cross over many, many different property owners. The average person wouldn't know how many property owners are there, but it is about kind of that bigger picture, and it's, you know, about making sure that people can get around the city and that people are going to be residents, existing and new residents, are going to have the services that they need.
Mm-hmm. So let's get into zoning now. We've now sort of taken that 30,000 foot view. We've now decided or agreed that we want to make sure that there's a logical progression that meets the end goal, whether it's accessibility through public transit or just moving traffic in general. So land use planning is a hub for a whole bunch of other disciplines to provide input, for example, traffic.
Absolutely. So, I mean, development services itself has transportation planning within it. And when we develop a document like the official plan or the comprehensive zoning bylaw, you know, I can assure you that every city department is reviewing the document, having their input into it, whether it's waste or transit or transportation or public utilities. Like, as I said, you kind of name it: operations, roads, snow clearing, all of those internal departments take a look at it to make sure that what we're proposing aligns with, quite frankly, the service that we can offer as a city. But I mean, I think the biggest piece of that is, as I said, is just that coordination of land use planning and different types of land uses. It's all about kind of providing services to people. So different types of land uses actually generate different public behavior. Like if you're buying a pair of shoes, you're going into a store buying a pair of shoes and kind of leaving. You're probably in and out like in 20 minutes versus like if you're going to a mall, you're probably going to be in a mall a bit longer. Or if you're going to work, you're going to go and sit and park and work for 6 or 8 or 7 hours, and then you're going to leave. Daycares, as an example, there's like busy in the morning, busy at night. So it's about kind of looking at the type of land use and just making sure that all of the services are there. You hear a lot about like off-peak and peak and off-peak, and how can land uses work together. You hear a lot about like which land uses are more compatible side by side. When you think about factories or industrial developments, you typically don't see them super close to residential. Why? Because they're kind of noisy and have a lot of maybe truck traffic, like things that aren't necessarily desirable for a residential community. So we try to make those kind of bigger connections that maybe kind of the average resident or business owner doesn't necessarily realize that that's a big part of what land use planning is kind of balancing all of those uses, making sure that they're still in our city, like making sure that there's still availability. If a new business wants to open up, we want to be able to say, yes, we've got this property for you, or this plaza, or that kind of thing. In the same way, if a resident wants to move to Barrie, you want to say, yes, you've got this housing. You can buy a single, you can buy a semi, you can buy a townhouse, you can buy a condo. You want to have those things available for people, but it is a complex kind of equation to make sure that you're trying to provide as many services to as many people as possible.
So in land use planning, you are looking to look out for the best interests of existing and legacy land property owners or families who live here and who maybe invest in the business, but you're also looking to how does this city attract new investment and new businesses to grow as the city continues to grow. We talk about a walkable city or a 15-minute city. Is that a term that I got right?
15 minutes, yeah.
How does that apply in what you're doing here?
So, I mean, I think it's traditionally actually not traditionally, historically, many cities were developed with lots of mixed use developments. You'd see like a shop with a residence above it, and then we kind of actually shifted from that and got into more like segregation of land uses. Here's your shops, here's your businesses, here's your residential. Now we're kind of going back a little bit to that mix where, you know, you might have a shop within a walkable distance, you can walk to school, but again, it does take all of that infrastructure piece. People aren't going to walk to school if there's not sidewalks. People aren't going to bike to school if there's not bike lanes. So there is that. People aren't going to take transit and maybe not have a car if there's not transit available. So it kind of all goes kind of hand in hand, and that actually extends much beyond land use planning.
Mm-hmm. So when we come back from the break, I want to discuss with you the term return on investment.
Okay.
As it applies to land use planning, and I'll let you stew on that and think about it during the break. But think about it across all the different zoning categories. We will get into zoning as well, obviously, because you've just really teed that up for us. But really, from a planning perspective, how do we ensure a positive or the highest level of return on investment?
Okay.
So stay with us. We'll be right back after this break with more from Michelle Banfield, Director of Development Services with the City of Barrie. This is Barrie, a city constantly evolving. At any time, a whole host of pressures challenge the intricate tapestry of city government. In this series, we will explore the priorities deemed essential for progress, even if they don't always inspire unanimous applause. Join me each week for a candid conversation with a member of our city government as we uncover the stories behind the scenes of Barrie, a city on the move. Welcome back to Barrie City on the Move. Michelle Banfield and I are having a conversation around land use planning, zoning, and I left you with a thought around return on investment when it comes to land use planning.
Well, I'm certainly not an investment advisor, but I think that you don't have to be one to understand that property and property values, as they increase, create wealth for an individual homeowner or a developer. And a developer really is no different. We all have roles in community building, I always say, and the developer's role is to buy property and develop profitable projects. At the end of the day, if the project doesn't make sense, they're not going to build it. And if they don't build it, who is going to build it? So they play a key role in developing our communities. Planners play a key role in it, council members play a key role in it, our residents do, but so do developers. So at the end of the day, it's about making wise choices and wise investment choices. Land as a resource, infrastructure to service that land, whether it's water, sanitary, storm sewer, all of those types of things, they're investments as well. And so obviously the more units, whether it's residential or commercial or industrial, doesn't matter what the land use is, the more units that are serviced by these infrastructure costs, the better it is for everybody. And I don't necessarily think that people understand, unless you're really in the industry, how expensive constructing new infrastructure is, how expensive updating old infrastructure is. You just have to take a look at the city's capital plan to get an understanding of that. And so when you're spending literally billions of dollars on services to a community, the more people that use it, the better.
Mm-hmm.
And
so Michelle, just by way of providing some context,
yeah.
I mean, it's, first of all, the way we do things currently is still relatively a new art and science combination. And our city here recently went through, and I'm going to say we're probably still living the sort of the fallout, if you will, or the residual of this massive eye-opening exercise that had city officials and governance recognizing that after 50 years, suddenly we had to pay for infrastructure renewal. And that maybe we, those who were at the helm 50 years ago maybe didn't set the trend or the example of putting aside for eventual infrastructure updating and renewal sort of 50 years later, right? Mm-hmm. So just putting things into context, you talked about billions of dollars. There was a magic number of about $3 billion that we were looking at over the next I don't know if it was 10 years for infrastructure renewal?
I don't have that number.
Okay,
I'm
fair
not
enough.
probably the best person to kind of give you that actual number, but as I said, there are definitely people at the City of Barrie, and as you can take a look at our capital, the 10-year capital plan, to look at those kind of totals of dollars. But as I said, at the end of the day, those infrastructure projects are really expensive, and I think for most people, you hear a lot about the condition of our roads. Like, that's what people are on, right? So if they're bumpy or if they're, but quite frankly, the roads are probably one of our best assets in terms of how well they're maintained, and sometimes the pipes beneath them are actually in much worse shape than the roads themselves, right? But it's not fun money to spend, let's just put it that way, when city councils could be building new parks or new rec centers or new libraries. That's way more fun than the infrastructure renewal piece to it. Yet at the end of the day, when you flush your toilet or turn on your tap, there's expectations that your drinking water's safe and that you're going to be able to flush your toilet.
But there is an argument that says for every kilometer of road built, and that road built is not just the top coat asphalt, but it's actually the infrastructure below ground, as you talked about, all the services below ground, so that when you flush your toilet, for example. But to spread that cost over multiple units versus singular units. So the conversation around condos and apartments and townhomes, et cetera, as opposed to detached homes, the ability to spread that cost over many is part of a game plan, I think, in terms of an affordability strategy. Absolutely.
And I think you hear that the economies of scale of building, a single detached home versus a semi versus a townhouse, like there's some economies of scale that it's no more expensive to build 3 units than it is to build 1, and then obviously 3 people can live in the house. So there is some of those economies of scale for sure.
Excellent. So as you're planning now, and I will throw this out there as well, over the last 5 years, we've seen a lot of change in our daily lives as citizens, including, I hate to bring it back up, but that thing called the pandemic that we all hopefully endured. It wasn't fun. You talk about things that are not fun. It wasn't fun. But prior to the pandemic, there was a lot of a trajectory towards building multiples, and then consumer habits and consumer concerns were raised around living in congregate setting, getting on an elevator with each other, and that caused us sort of a moment to pause and reflect, what do I want to do? And we saw a fair amount of migration away from the GTA to municipalities and towns surrounding the GTA and even over East Coast and West Coast for people looking for a detached home. Did that change, and did that have an impact on the work that you and your colleagues are doing around city planning?
Well, I think at the end of the day, from a planning perspective, we talk about ground-related housing. And so that can be any sort of housing where you kind of walk up front stairs and walk in a front door. So that can be a single for sure, but it can be a semi, it can be townhouses, it can be those detached coach houses we talked about. So that ground-related housing is very strong in the City of Barrie. It really is a market. And if you look at the south end of the city and the new developments that are happening there, yes, there's certainly some smaller condos, the 6-story condos or some multi-use buildings, but you still do see a lot of ground-related housing, either in the form of single, semis, or townhouses. And so I do think that the City of Barrie itself, that is a bit of a niche market. Now, where you're seeing kind of the higher rise buildings are kind of in our downtown or on our intensification corridors, which quite frankly are areas that's where you would actually want to see them. So that's kind of good. We're still seeing some cranes in the air, and we're still seeing some of those high-rise developments getting built and occupied, which is really exciting. I'm not sure. I think anything with COVID, just generally speaking, the trends that we saw at COVID time, I think some of the decisions and some of those trends aren't going to be long lasting, and we're already seeing it with the return to the workplace, and people are making different changes, travel decisions, all those sorts of things. I don't necessarily know whether we're going to know that long-term kind of output. We've seen obviously a big change in the retail market landscape because of COVID and that reliance on online services in a way that was starting for sure. Like, it certainly wasn't brand new, but you really saw a bigger shift during COVID, right? So I think at the end of the day, some of those shifts will probably stay, and then some of the shifts will probably be a little bit less dramatic, and will maybe kind of end up that term hybrid, where it's a little bit like it was before, and maybe not quite as as it was during COVID. But as I said, at the end of the day, the ground-related market at the City of Barrie for new housing in particular is still very strong and still very much what the builders in the community are saying buyers want when they come to the City of Barrie.
So we talk about consumer trends and habits. We talk about planning for the future, that for our children to inherit a great quality of life and place to live, work, and play. You have this consultation, you have this community engagement happening right now, and you're discussing changes to the proposed changes to the zoning bylaw, the inclusion of or the discussion around coach houses, laneway houses, et cetera. Take us on a bit of a tour.
So the zoning bylaw really, as I said at the earlier start of this, that it really brings the vision of the official plan to life. It is a new zoning bylaw. It's not being tweaked. It's not a housekeeping amendment that I talked about. It is a new zoning bylaw. There's new zones. There's going to be new provisions. Some of the biggest changes definitely are what I kind of just talked about, that change in where predominantly currently, a lot of the City of Barrie lands are zoned only for single detached homes. And that's going to be a big shift. And that change is going to, really impact the communities in Barrie, where now you're going to be able to do semi-detached or row houses or the coach houses, as we talked about earlier. So that's one of the big changes. There's some flexibility, a little bit more flexibility in some of the land use permissions for commercial uses, where if you look at the old zoning bylaw, it was very specific, like a floral shop and a shoe shop and and at the end of the day, like I said, if you're going in to buy something, you go in, you buy. Does it really matter whether you're selling shoes or flowers, that kind of thing. The same thing with the industrial uses. We're like really trying to respond to industrial trends where we're not necessarily seeing, we still are to a certain extent, but that warehousing type big footprint of industrial buildings, but really trying to kind of be flexible and responding to how trades and industry has become so much more technical, so kind of responding to that. Parking is a big one. When you look at kind of older zoning bylaws that had very strict parking requirements, very, quite frankly, high parking requirements, and yet when you're talking about using land and resources wisely, is it wise to use land to park cars? Many of us have examples of driving past many places where parking lots are invariably empty many times of the day or many times of the week. For sure, there's times when people can't find parking in certain spots, but if you actually look kind of wholesale across the city, there's many times that parking isn't used to its maximum. So trying to kind of reduce some of the parking requirements as well. Those are kind of some of the biggest changes, but fundamentally, not to downplay the change in kind of that residential land use that we're now calling neighborhood. It's called the neighborhood zones, and it's really trying to talk about what we talked about, the mix of uses, the mix of housing types and residential built forms. I always say, years and years ago, planning as a profession talked about single detached homes and semi-detached and townhouses, almost like they were different land uses. They're not different land uses. People live there. Like you walk into your house, you live there, you go home, that kind of thing. The built form for sure has changed, and there's definitely complexities, whether you're having like one person live in a building versus 100, for sure. But at the end of the day, the use is the same. So I think that's going to be a big shift. And certainly the people we talked about that have been in the city for a long time, that is going to be a change for them, and change is hard in some cases. Some neighborhoods are going to be more prone to seeing some of that change. Some are going to be a little bit less prone to it, just based on the lot size and kind of what's already there and how developed they already are. But that's kind of like setting, again, the city up for the future and like kind of future zoning trends. And we talked a bit kind of off camera about home occupations and how that is, how that's skyrocketing. And for the most part, people can have a business in their home and neighbors don't even know about it. Like, there's definitely a few types of land uses that are, that actually, quite frankly, aren't allowed in to be home occupations. Sometimes they happen anyway, and we have to kind of deal with the property owner then. But generally speaking, a lot of those home occupations can operate without any impact at all to the surrounding neighborhood.
Now, I'll just throw this out there. You're not in bylaw enforcement yourself, and I appreciate that, but is that a case of the law evolving to match society, or society being expected to comply with law?
So we do have in development services, there is zoning enforcement. So if people have built a shed perhaps too close to their property line, or if they're parking on their front lawn, or if they maybe have a second suite that's not registered. So there is actually an element of enforcement in development services. Property standards is a bit different, making sure that your property looks clean and nice and that sort of thing. So there is some members of my team that kind of touch on that enforcement bit a little bit. And like everything with enforcement in the city of Barrie, if you follow it closely, it really is often complaint-based. It's not often proactive, where City of Barrie residents are going out knocking on people's doors saying, hey, what's your home occupation? Most times it's in response to something that we've heard from someone in the community.
So when we come back from the break, let's look to the future a little bit and paint a picture of what the city might look at, or where we might see the start of some of these changes. So
sure.
We'll be right back with more from Michelle Banfield right after this break. Welcome back to Barrie City on the Move. We're talking planning. We're talking about the future of the city. Michelle, let's get into this. What does it look like in the future? And let's start with a lot of people say, we've seen a sign up on this property. It's been a year or maybe longer. Is anything ever going to happen? I want to just throw this out there as a bit of a disclaimer. It is not the city that determines the rate of necessarily development. There's obviously a private landowner, or maybe a landowner's buyers group, et cetera, that's getting their financing in order, their drawings in order, they're analyzing things. But they tend to reach out to members of your team to work with you in something that's referred to as a pre-consultation to decide, will this conform? Does it make sense? This is a good plan going forward. Does the city and the landowner see eye to eye on a project? Tell us about that.
Sure. So pre-consultation really happens, and I think that's maybe why things seem like they take a long time, because actually at the City of Barrie, we consult with the community sooner than we have to. We do kind of non-statutory consultation, and that's the neighborhood meeting. So typically what happens is an applicant will come in for a pre-consultation and they'll say, hey city, we want to do this. And all city departments take a look at it and say, yes, great idea, or no, that doesn't really align with our vision, or okay, fine, but it's fine, but there's some things you need to be aware of. Then usually the developer then kind of takes that information away, sometimes revises their plans, but then the next thing we do, and that involves that kind of sign on the property, is we have what's called a neighborhood meeting, where usually the ward councillor attends, the applicant's consultants. We do that virtually, and that's when the neighborhood can kind of come in and hear about that proposal early in the process. It's actually before they file a formal planning application. And that's to get kind of that early community feedback before the developer finalizes all their plans and finalizes all their reports, is to get that early consultation. But it can take quite some time. From the perspective of the City of Barrie, we actually have been recognized, our planning process is actually recognized in the province as actually being one of the best from that perspective. Build does a report, and so for many reports we've been actually number one in terms of that response time to an actual planning application. But the process itself does take a bit of time, and even after you get your planning approval, there still is lots of work that not only the developer has to do, but the city as well, to kind of actually go from, as I said earlier, vacant land to people actually living in the property. But it's really important for people to, when they do see, as I said, see those properties in particular in their community, to look at those signs, see when the meetings are being held. If you can't come to the online one, we have the consultant's presentation is taped, so you can watch it later. and really just kind of pay attention to kind of what's happening in their community. Or if they do get that letter in the mail, pay attention. There's always a contact in there. Call the planner, find out what you want to know about what's happening in your community.
So you mentioned in the last segment that residents can anticipate some meaningful or impactful changes in the near to midterm future. Let's talk about some of those. You mentioned earlier as well some of the major corridors, and some that come to mind would be ESSA, would be Yonge Street, for example, Bayfield. I know there are others, but we actually have seen some, looks like buyers groups coming in and buying up some parcels or amalgamating and putting things together for a future project. Is that really where we're going to see the impact, or will we also see it within some of the neighborhoods themselves?
So I think you're going to see probably all of the things you mentioned. You're going to see some of the higher rise buildings in the downtown. Obviously, the Debut condos is under construction. Lack House is occupied. 37 Johnson, a new rental building, is going to be occupied soon. So you're seeing those high rise buildings in the downtown, but you're also kind of seeing those more mid rise buildings along the streets that you mentioned, Yonge Street, Essa Road, those types of things. You might still in the actual communities, the smaller neighborhoods, or the regular, I guess, if you will, residential neighborhoods. You'll see probably some of those coach houses. You might see some single lots being subdivided into semi-detached lots, or you might see a single being transferred into a triplex or something like that. So that would be kind of the type of change that you would see at the, I would say, more the local level, if you will. On streets like Bayfield Street, you most likely will see some sort of not necessarily revitalization, because the Bayfield Street's obviously very busy and provides a lot of services to a lot of people, but you might see some of those older plaza properties maybe have some mix of uses, talking a little bit about, if you don't need as much parking, could you maybe put a small apartment building there, or row of townhouses, or those types of things, kind of making good use of that land. Bayfield Street's a great example of property or properties that good access to the 400, good access, good transit access. Like there's a lot of good things about looking at developing on Bayfield Street. Even if you drive it every day or recently, and you're like, oh my gosh, it's like so busy. But I think in some cases, some of those changes actually make the traffic better. If you have more people relying on transit, and if you have, there's a whole environmental assessment going underway right now for Bayfield Street, and it's going to be followed up with some master planning work that council wants us to look at, right? So it's going to, when you put all those pieces together, ultimately the idea is to make things better. And I think that's the important thing about planning, is that in a lot of ways it really is about making things better. It's about bringing new residents to our community, which brings new workers, it brings new people in our schools, it brings new people to our places of worship. Having new residents is a great part of community building, and as I said, and people that want to open their businesses here. All of that is a product of land use planning and a product of development. So a lot of municipalities aren't even lucky enough to actually experience growth and actually to have development pressures. It's, from a land use planning perspective, the city of Barrie is a great place to work because there's so much going on and there's so many opportunities. And as I said, every development is an opportunity for city of Barrie residents.
Mm-hmm. As we talk about it, it's actually quite timely. We hear at a federal level and at a provincial level the re-evaluation of immigration programs, as well as international student programs. Certainly colleges have been retasked with ensuring that they've got adequate housing for their international students, or even students who are migrating sort of inter-provincially or intra-provincially. So as you're undertaking this exercise, I do believe that Bayfield was at least floated as an idea for some growth, for some increased density. A number of communities, and no disrespect when I say this, I imagine that the city of Barrie looks outside our city boundary for other examples. We refer to it as best practices or other innovative ideas that other municipalities are doing. When you look at Bayfield Street, there's been talk about putting residential over some of the mall structures, et cetera. I know that there's whether it's underpinning or whether the structure can hold it or whether you're demoing it and building new. But is that something that's on your radar? And again, sort of tying in another department, transit. I know that we now have buses going along the 400 to sort of shave off 45 minutes going from the south end to the north end. How does this all play together in what you're doing in terms of planning?
Well, I mean, I think you've just hit it on the head, is that it's not just one thing. And I think, even when you talk about the federal government and the provincial government really focusing on housing, and housing, of course, is very important. But, from a planning perspective, you would never want to say, housing is the be-all and end-all. You need to make sure that if you are focusing on the housing, which is important for sure, there's still those services when you get people living in your community, and that's where and that's really where land use planning and that bigger picture comes in. You can't just focus on housing alone, because then you're going to have a whole bunch of residents that aren't going to have their needs met, and that's not what community building is about. And Bayfield Street is interesting as well because, again, like as we talked about, it is busy. There are a lot of land uses there. It does provide a lot of services to not only our residents but those of Simcoe County. And I think, as I said, doing some of that environmental assessment work, which for those of you that kind of watch at home, that's when a big infrastructure project is going to happen. We do different studies to say, Bayfield Street's a little bit more of a straight line, but in some cases, like, should the road go this way? Should the road curve this way? And we do that kind of years before the project even happens. So that work is actually ongoing now. And if you go to buildingbarrie.ca, you'll be able to kind of get some information on it. But it's going to be putting all those pieces together. And again, if the idea isn't to add a whole bunch of more residents and redevelopment to Bayfield Street as it is today, because again, people that do frequent it are going to say, Michelle, you're off your rocker. That doesn't make any sense. But when you put it together with, like, as you said, infrastructure improvements, road improvements, a whole kind of revitalization of and again, I don't want to use that word because that makes it seem like it's dead. It's not dead at all. But if you talk about kind of responding to the trends of community building, Bayfield Street is a great example of opportunity. But all the pieces have to go together. It's not, if you just do the one piece, if you just kind of focus on getting a whole bunch more residents there without the other pieces, then again, you're going to get a bunch of residents in an area and they're not going to be happy. And that's the whole point. I mean, it really is about having people love where they live. And it's a challenge because everybody has diverse needs. And that's where a city is a little bit different than a smaller town. We have to respond to all sorts of needs.
So speaking of community engagement, opportunity, loving where you live, and buildingbarrie.ca, you've got a project that's near and dear to you that you're looking forward to, and it's a community engagement piece. Tell us what's coming up in the next few days and weeks.
So the zoning bylaw, the comprehensive zoning bylaw update project is alive and well. So we actually had a public meeting scheduled for October 1st, and we lost power at City Hall. So we had to actually reschedule. So we actually, the new public meeting time is November 14th. So I would encourage you to know your zone is what I'm telling residents. Like, take a look at the map. The zoning maps are the easiest way for you to see kind of what's happening around you. I said, look at where you work, look at where your kids go to school, look at where you shop, take a look, know those zones, and then just provide us your feedback. And anything that comes in, like I said earlier, anything that comes in through the zoning bylaw consultation period, staff will respond to, not individually to you. I wouldn't. Yeah, collectively.
They gather it all.
A staff report that goes back to council is going to say, we heard this zone at 4 stories is too high, and council and staff will either say, yeah, you're right, we're going to lower it, or no, we think it's 4 stories, and that's how we should keep it.
So the best way people can participate is?
You can, buildingbarrie.ca.
There it is.
You can register for it. The public meeting itself, you can either come in person, it's at the council chambers at 6 o'clock on the 14th, or you can actually participate virtually just on a Zoom call if you actually can't make it into City Hall. And
residents can put their name or email address in to receive updates as it goes.
Correct.
As per normal. Okay.
Correct.
This is phenomenal. I can see it's near and dear to your heart. I can see that you love what you do, and residents of Barrie are fortunate to have you leading that department as the Executive Director of Development Services. Michelle Banfield, thanks so much for giving me your time and joining me on Barrie City on the Move. I really enjoy speaking with you all the time, and really glad you're able to be here.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. And we will see you next time on Barrie City on the Move. Take care.